Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 41, Sword and Soul, Part 4. Power ebbed and swelled with the thunder of a heavy storm, coalescing upon a single being. The power surrounding him was immense, such that it was almost entirely overwhelming. Ichigo could feel it, the slow loss of his reasoning, but he held fast. Initially, he had no idea what it was that he wanted to do by participating in such a large conflict, but the answer was always in front of him. He had just had to stay true to himself. It didn't matter which side he stood on, so long as he was protecting those that he wished to protect. That was the whole meaning of his name, and if strength was the only way he could achieve that goal, then so be it, he would take it and call it his own. Zanjutsu clinked lightly within his hand. The butcher-like blade had morphed into a sleeker form, light and agile. The horns protruding from atop his masked visage had become more pronounced than before, almost menacing in the way it gathered swaths of red and black spiritual energy. His mouth gradually opened to release a cloud of vapor before a howl ripped across the battlefield. Madness, fury, rage, it was a maelstrom of corrupt energy that was undoubtedly hollow. Vasto Lord. The greatest form of grand hollows following Ajichas. It was domineering. Without care for those around it, the power pressured the entire area. Air itself seemed to distort, creating fine lines that immediately pressed Hollow and Shinigami alike onto the ground. Veins popped up over their necks and faces, but no amount of struggling allowed them to get back up. The greatest strength of a Hollow was not in fine technique or uniqueness of skill, but something primal. Nell taught him that. Give direction. Give motive. And let instinct take over. This time he was ready. This time he understood. In a single breath, he released the last vestiges of the Shinigami power within him, resisting the transformation, storing it away instead for later use. The change was swift. I will trust you. He was looking at the white image of himself within his inner world. All he got in return was a light grin. Very well. And then his body was moving. The aura surrounding him only intensified, drawing the attention of Hollow and Shinigami alike. With a step, only the buzzing noise of a Hollow's sonito was left in the wind. Nell's eyes widened in the next instant. Even the Arrancar and enemies around her were no different. He stood in between all of them, creating a stark divide that couldn't be ignored. Nell was panting in exhaustion, blood pouring profusely from her injuries, and yet she showed no signs of faltering in her convictions. It was only after he had created a temporary respite to the battle that he noticed that she was wobbling due to all her wounds. While he still had his rationality, he appeared beside her and used an arm to support her. She was looking at him vacantly, as if she couldn't believe that it was actually him. Afterwards, she looked at the other individual that he was carrying in his other arm. It was the injured Arrancar from earlier. Ichigo, you dash. He cut her off by turning his head. He didn't have much time left of his rationality, so he didn't wish to waste his time on any explanations. Moreover, he angled his sword behind his back, and a clang resounded as he blocked the descent of a massive blade held by a giant. Another one. The voice came from Captain Seijin Komamura. The man was frowning heavily, his expression set into a grimace. Seijin Komamura did not possess the face of a man, but instead one of a brown wolf. When his lips parted upwards, it revealed a sharp set of canines. Seijin was already having trouble with Nell alone, and the fact that Ichigo suddenly arrived without warning and with such potent spiritual energy, left dread within Seijin's chest. Worse, he turned towards Karen, Ishida, Chad, Rukia, and Orium, who had been helping him against Nell. Upon Ichigo's arrival, all of them had ceased their attacks. The situation was not looking good from Seijin's perspective. Another Vasto Lord-class Arrancar had arrived, and his squad of Shinigami were already struggling with the lower-leveled Arrancar before them. Without aid, the situation would not end well. No. If he could defeat the new arrival swiftly, then the tides of battle could still be changed. Seijin clutched onto his sword, the burden known as responsibility weighing down on his shoulders. Everywhere that he looked, he could see blood and death. It was only in his area alone that the violence was coming to a halt due to the pressure Ichigo was releasing. Seijin could not permit this. He had to hurry and defeat his enemies so that he could come to the aid of his allies. More importantly, his gaze shifted towards the dome of fire in the air. Can aim. Why, old friend? Why did you betray the Siriti? The grip Seijin had over his sword tightened. He was done waiting. Kokyajo Tenjin Myo, Divine Retribution, Black Ropes of Ruination. The giant formed above Seijin began to move. It was a giant that resembled the form of a samurai's armor. Whatever movements Seijin completed, the giant reflected both in speed, power, and durability. Seeing that his initial strike had proved ineffective, Seijin pulled his weapon back and went in for another blow. Wait, Captain Seijin, stop! Rukia called out. Bastard, stop, that's my brother. Ichigo, move. Seijin ignored the shouting. He could feel the desperation within Rukia and the others' tones, but none of them had truly understood the nature that was war. No matter how Seijin felt about taking the life of his enemies, they would not show the same form of hesitance. Doubt itself had no place in the battlefield, and even though he could infer that Karen and the others knew Ichigo as a person, all Seijin could see right now was a hollow that needed to be put down. Rukia and the others could ignore all else and rely on their emotions, but Seijin could not ignore the Shinigami under him crumpling to the ground from the sheer brutality of Ichigo's current spiritual pressure. Moreover, if Ichigo truly was an ally, then why did he appear on the side of the enemy in support? No matter. Seijin had people whose lives were depending on him. He could not afford to hesitate despite the inklings of uncertainty in his mind. Seijin's second attack came swiftly and gave little room for any breather, and yet once again, it was blocked in the same nonchalant manner. Was the enemy looking down on him? The thought caused Seijin to put even more effort into his strikes, but for his part, Ichigo was more concerned with sorting everything out before his reasoning eroded away. Ichigo pushed Nell safely away from him as he parried Seijin's strikes, following which he turned towards Orium. He could remember the type of power Orium possessed, and it was one that could heal even the worst of injuries, assuming that the individual himself was not dead. It was exactly what he needed. Orium, he called out. His voice was deep, tinged with a dark rasp. He could not mutter too many words or even sentences at all as he devoted his attention on keeping himself rational. Without even speaking, he gently pushed the injured Aaron in his hands towards Orium. His intentions were clear, and Orium and mostly Karen understood what he wanted in an instant. Is that really you, Ichigo? Orium called out softly, as if to verify. He merely nodded as he batted away another of Seijin's strikes. They were becoming far more numerous now and were hailing down on him with the force to sever mountains. Still, he remained unperturbed. The spectacle was shocking to all. Nell was powerful and she could probably replicate a similar feat, but, right now it was clear that Ichigo's power was on another level. To Nell, it almost felt like she was staring at Shiro when the man was serious. It was a similar impression, and if that was truly the case, then what would come next was simply unavoidable. Nell watched as a bright orange barrier emerged before Orium's hands and enveloped the injured Aaron. Moments later, the wounds that would have had proved life-threatening were nowhere to be seen. The Aaron himself was simply still in an unconscious state. The enmity had been dealt with. Ichigo's eyes seemed to be saying so towards Nell as he turned to stare at her. Fine then. Nell eased her grip on her lance, allowing herself to lose the tension forming over her body. She staggered. Lady Nell. The Aaron nearest to her moved to help her, but she quickly waved them off. She wanted to see what answer Ichigo had arrived at. Even if he was successful in healing the Aaron that had been injured, it didn't change the fact that they were currently at war. The Shinigami would not so easily accede and lay down their arms. It was the whole reason that Shiro was fighting. From one protector to another, what differences did they make in their decisions? Humans were selfish. To save was, in short, an action born from the selfishness of one's self to impose upon others. In the end, the concept of protection meant that one had to have the means and capabilities to cherish what they held dear. It was the most basic form of instinct, like a mother protecting their young, and Ichigo took it to the next level. His rationality gradually fading from him, the only thing left in his mind was to protect. He would protect them. At the same time Seijin struck another blow, the area itself began to bend and distort from an outward explosion of spiritual energy. Rather than block the sword of Seijin's giant, a hand grabbed outwards and stopped the massive edge of metal in its tracks. "Impossible," Seijin muttered out before his vision blackened. A palm had appeared directly in front of his face, grabbing onto Seijin and flinging him outwards. Seijin tumbled in the air, but he was an experienced captain and quickly reoriented himself fast enough to see a bright red sphere pointed directly at his bankai. Zero. The doom blast known to be only usable by hollows, and it was massive. The tendrils of black and red forming around the sphere resembled sparks of electricity that charred the ground and everything around. The might of the attack was such that it drew the attention of all present fighting across the fake Karakura town. It was a dazzling crimson echoed by the furious roar of a Vasto lord. The hollows turned Arrancar cheered, while the expressions of all the other Shinigami paled. It wasn't enough that Ichigo's aura alone was overbearing, but his current strength too was nothing to scoff at. The attack was launched, and swelled in size in an instant, completely engulfing the massive giant that was Seijin's bankai. Blood erupted from around Seijin as he fell to the ground in a heap. Sturdy as Seijin's bankai was, there was weakness to it. Any and all injuries inflicted upon the armored giant would be directly transmitted back to Seijin himself. The power of Ichigo's 1-0 annihilated the giant's left arm, leaving behind only an empty appendage. Unable to fight anymore, the giant crumbled as Seijin breathed heavily to conserve his remaining spiritual energy. Karin, Orium, Chad, Ishida, and the others didn't dare approach Ichigo lightly right now. All of them, including Nell and the other Arrancar she led, were behind Ichigo's back. Rather than continue his assault, Ichigo merely stood there as the remnants of the zero he fired began to vanish. The Arrancars around Nell turned to her to ask for directions, but Nell herself only shook her head. She had a feeling that if she gave the signal to continue fighting, then Ichigo would move to stop her. He'd already made his stance clear. He did not wish for anyone to fight anymore. Hollow or Shinigami, none were truly too different from one another, simply the reflections of white and black. Ichigo would not move. He would not bend, nor break in his decision. Friend or enemy, the last thoughts he had before succumbing to his base instincts were to protect those he wished to protect. Nothing else mattered, and if anyone dared approach the area he was at lightly, then he would stop them. All those who would see his back, were the ones he would protect. He was giving a sign for all Shinigami and Arrancar fighting in the fake Karamura town, that there was another option available. He didn't want to choose between one side or another. Instead, like the ideals of a certain fool, he wished to walk the path of saving everyone. Ah, another one's shown up. Shunsui tipped the top of his hat over his head, shadows forming over his bangs and obscuring his facial expression while he glanced at Seijin's direction. At the very least, Seijin wasn't dead yet, and reinforcements could still be sent. Captain Soiphone was on the way, assuming that she could deal with the Arrancar Vega fast enough, but something was telling Shunsui that Seijin's location was perhaps the safest in the current predicament. That was one hell of a blast. Shunsui could still recall the vividness of it. A feeling of power that could rival even the head captains. Of course, it was only on intuition alone, but the fact itself that another hollow with such power existed was hard to stomach when Old Man Yama was already preoccupied with Aizen and the Vasto of White. Morale was already at an all-time low. The Shinigami were experiencing setback after setback, and it all boiled down to the fact that their information about Hueco Mundo's power was inadequate. Many of the unseated officers had already perished in the line of duty, and despite it not showing on his face, he was infuriated. The enemies that they were facing were far more powerful than what the reports could have had ever described, and he was dealing with the one that was possibly the strongest. The Primera. Barragan Lusenburn. Ah, what a pain. Shunsui sighed regretfully. Did it really have to come to this? He was of the opinion that the hollows could be reasoned with solely because of a single fact. The Vasto of White had invaded the Siriti just to save the life of a comrade. That right there meant that hollows weren't just the emotionless killing machines that the Academy textbook made them out to be. Still, no matter how he saw things, it wouldn't change anything. He brushed back a lock of brown hair that fell past his eyes. It was time to get serious. He simply could not just leave Old Man Yama alone to deal with everything. Shunsui could already imagine the type of pressure that the head commander was facing at the moment. He needed to do his part as the student of the captain of the first division. "Oi oi, your opponent is supposed to be me," he called out absently, shifting his feet in the direction Baragan was intending on going. Baragan was entrusted to lead the army of Arankar. As much as he wished to settle the conflict with Shunsui, Baragan still had a strategic mind. His power was better spent against larger groups of individuals rather than a single fool. Besides, the more chaos he sowed, the more enemies he would garner anyway. "You wish to block me, your impudence knows no bounds." Baragan didn't put Shunsui in his eyes. A sword came near Baragan, but as if the world itself was bending, the speed of Shunsui's strike slowed to a crawl. This was the concept of time. Time that ages. Time that alters and withers. Age and death. Is that all? Baragan's tone was dry. In the same way a human would not care for the crawling of an ant, Baragan placed no importance on the enemy attacking him, rather he enjoyed the concept of toying with his opponents. He'd see them run, to hide, and then still discover that their actions were utterly meaningless before him. This aspect of himself had not changed, and was something that Shiro often exploited in their duels. Alternatively, Baragan had learned not to underestimate his opponents, but that fact only held true for those he deemed worthy of his attention. "You are not worthy." He extended a hand outward to grasp at Shunsui, but as quick as Shunsui came, he left with a small grin. Baragan was perplexed, but his expression shifted into one of confusion when he noticed a peculiarity. Shunsui had come close to him to strike, but the thing was, in his released form, Baragan's respira covered him entirely in a thick cloud of death. Without coming into contact with his respira, Shunsui should not have had been able to strike him. Sure enough, when Baragan scrutinized Shunsui, he noticed lingering mists of his respira over the pink kimono Shunsui wore. You do not rot." The question escaped Baragan in his momentary confusion. "Well, I suppose it's true that all things rot including myself, but this mist is cheating according to the rules of the game." Shunsui pulled off his pink kimono and left it on the side. "Game." Baragan recalled Shunsui's earlier comment at the start of the confrontation. "Yes, a game," Shunsui smiled lightly. "Children's games to be more exact, but it all depends on Katen Kyokotsu's mood." Baragan unleashed his respira all around him. The buildings and streets nearest to him touched by the miasma instantly aged and crumbled into dust. "Do you take me for a fool?" Shunsui shook his head nonchalantly. "No, you're a troublesome walking disaster." Shunsui could not allow Baragan to enter a populated location of Shinigami. Baragan's power was like a flame. Should one get burned, the one burned possessed the risk of spreading the fire. In an already crowded world with hundreds of combatants, Baragan could not be allowed to fight and use his power freely. Shunsui understood this concept thoroughly. This was why even in confronting Baragan, he had to do so in a way that restricted Baragan into following him into locations devoid of allies. As it was now, Baragan had charged in alone deep into Shinigami ranks. Starting a fight where they were now would only lead to more casualties. Baragan considered Shunsui's remark, but scoffed in the next second. He did not understand nor did he wish to. He'd never met any Shinigami that could force his hand either. Without another thought, Baragan ignored Shunsui despite his curiosity at how Shunsui had disabled his respira. He used a burst of Sonido to appear in another location, but suddenly felt a chill travel down his back. He bristled, looking at the small cut that appeared over his left arm just above the gold-bangled jewels that he adorned over it. He turned back to stare at Shunsui, but the man hadn't even moved from his original location. What was going on? Baragan frowned for the first time. Despite how small a cut had manifested on his arm, the fact that it broke through his iero or steel skin proved that he could not take the situation lightly. It was almost as if there was a reaper hanging over him. The feeling made him uneasy. "What did you do?" His voice traveled directly back towards Shunsui. Of course, Shunsui did not answer and instead shot off in a different direction. Baragan tried to make nothing of it, but he soon came to realize a stunning fact. The farther away Shunsui was, the more damage Baragan would randomly sustain. Worse, Baragan could not identify what exactly was attacking him even after coating himself entirely in a cloud of respira. The small cut that had formed on the bone of his arm had now become more pronounced. Baragan was no fool, and he immediately took chase after Shunsui, the damage he sustained reducing with the distance. The entire situation appeared to be a game of cat and mouse, but in its simplest form, it was a child's game. Enough with this. Having grown fed up, Baragan rapidly shot out a mist of Respira. Seemingly unafraid of the attack, Shunsui was bathed in it. Having followed after Shunsui at full speed, the gap between the two was no longer substantial, roughly 10 feet away from each other. There was no room to miss. No room to doubt, and yet the impossible once again appeared under Baragan's eyes. "I didn't think that would smell so bad," Shunsui commented lightly with a hand over his nose. "Still, like I said, that's cheating, so it doesn't count." Baragan was stunned. Cheating? He could no longer ignore the fool in front of him. Baragan began to think. A child's game? The very concept of a game was an activity to be played for one's entertainment, whether with others or with one's self. Rules for certain games were of course obvious. The seeker in hide-and-seek could not peek while counting, and similarly, a game of tag required the direct touching of one individual to another. Projectiles did not count. If Baragan considered this notion properly, then he could somewhat understand what was happening. It wasn't that his Respira wasn't working, but that it was being invalidated due to something changing the laws of the world to bend to the whims of a children's game. He glared at Shunsui after the realization. "You dare to play such trickery on a god?" Shunsui didn't answer, but the fact that he ran faster was enough of an indication. In Katen Kyokotsu's variation of tag, it was more akin to chasing animals. Only the slowest would be met with the attack of the predator. Both participants in the game were considered players. From the very moment Shunsui initiated his first attack, he had labeled Baragan as it. The two were running from a phantom beast, and the one designated it was considered the slower runner directly within reach of the monster. It was a game of life and death. You win, you live. You lose, you die. It was a notion born from the fickle nature of Katen Kyokotsu. Baragan had to directly strike Shunsui to designate Shunsui as it. Only then would his attacks have any effect. The realization frustrated Baragan to no end, and Shunsui was entirely content to spend the entire time luring Baragan away from the battlefield. Shunsui readjusted the hat over his head. No matter how Shunsui reasoned with it, the fact that he had to devote his time to keep Baragan away was the same as putting himself out of commission for the battle. And yet this was war. Shunsui understood that his impact against an army would never be able to rival Baragan's, so the trade-off was good enough to undertake. Besides, he wouldn't always run. As soon as he found a suitable area, the game itself may take a change. Until then, it's up to you now, Yukatake. Cursed Shinigami. Fight me like the worm you are. He lowered his head and sped off in a burst of flash step. The sight of Baragan's mad chase after Shunsui across the battlefield was only temporary, and it wasn't something that Shiro could distract himself with for long. His current battle at the highest point of the fake Karakura town against Yamamoto was a careful dance of power and technique. He could neither draw too much on his spiritual energy, nor could he unleash it to pressure his opponent. The same could be said for Yamamoto. Should they unleash the true extent of their spiritual power, then they would kill almost all of the combatants currently present within the dimension. Give up. Shiro blocked a sword strike with Kanshou, while shifting his weight to the side and retaliating with Bakia. Our battle will only cause more death. Yamamoto did not respond. He'd been mute since the start of the fight itself. There was no reasoning with the man, and Yamamoto would simply not hear any of it. It irked Shiro to face someone so unreasonable. He backed away slowly, hardly any damage on his person. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's Haori had long since been cut apart into pieces to reveal his muscled chest. Yamamoto did not attack immediately, almost as if the man had no intention of taking the initiative. What exactly was Yamamoto waiting for? Without even having to think too deeply on the matter, Shiro could tell that Haribo, Nell, Starkey, Baragan, and the others had more than enough power to destroy the towers set up in the fake dimension. As such, why was Yamamoto so calm? A slight unease was beginning to form within him. Shiro was strong given his current abilities, but something he'd learned to trust more than his capabilities was his intuition. Something wasn't quite right and it was bothering him. He was far weaker than he had been in the past, and that was solely because of the actions of his past self. His reality was no longer within him, but projected as a world of its own entirely in Hueco Mundo. Outside of Hueco Mundo he was the most vulnerable, and this was why he was cautious. Yamamoto would not speak to him, but over the course of their numerous exchanges, Shiro had come to a realization. Yamamoto was buying time. For what, Shiro didn't know, but he wasn't inclined to find out. Trace, on. Swords formed around him in circles that each pointed a blade in Yamamoto's direction. The man stiffened at the sight and tried to summon forth a wall of his own flame, but Ryujinjaka seemed reluctant to comply. In truth, Yamamoto could not understand the hesitance found in his sword, and it was severely limiting him. Zanpakutos were extensions of a Shinigami's soul, and the fact that his own sword refused to comply with him meant that in some part of Yamamoto's being, he did not view Shiro as an enemy. Rather, there were traces of admiration to be felt for the corrupted soul before him. If Shiro could be purified, and his soul reincarnated into the Seirai, then it would surely be the birth of an unparalleled Shinigami. Yamamoto had no doubts. Truly a pity that Shiro ended up a hollow. Considering his current strength, Yamamoto didn't place much hope in defeating Shiro by himself. It was almost time now anyway. He stared grimly at the swords pointed in his direction and fearlessly charged ahead. Shiro did not wait to be attacked. The swords above him shot forth like rain, and despite Ryujinjaka's reluctance to comply with Yamamoto, Yamamoto was skilled enough with his sword to deflect everything. They exchanged blow after blow, neither getting the advantage over the other, but it was becoming increasingly clear that Shiro was getting the upper hand. He had been conserving his strength from the start, keeping half of his attention down on Baragan and the rest while still keeping Yamamoto at bay. He had his duty and his will not to see anyone he cherished come to harm. He would protect them, just as he could see Ichigo doing down below. Ichigo's area was the only area devoid of fighting, and it wasn't because the combatants there were willing to put aside their differences. Instead, the sheer power and presence Ichigo exuded forced compliance. None dared to attack him, and none dared attack each other lest they provoke Ichigo into action. Ichigo himself was the neutral party in the entire war, and Shiro couldn't help but see a part of his personality reflected in the youth. They were both people who protected others. It was commendable, and something that Shiro praised. Still, he couldn't allow the stalemate to last forever. Yamamoto was panting. No matter how strong of a Shinigami he was, right now, Shiro was undoubtedly stronger. In terms of endurance and attack power, Shiro was on top, and he found it hard to believe that Yamamoto could still be pushing himself under such a hopeless situation. It was time to end it. He gathered magical power in his palm and infused it with his spiritual energy as a Vasto Lord. I am the bone of my sword. Immediately, the aura around him shifted. Yamamoto had threatened to endanger his allies by releasing his power over the area, but what if he could defeat Yamamoto before the man was able to do such a thing? What he needed was something unique. A strike that would come immediately, leaving no room to dodge. A red spear. A cursed spear. He knew its name. He knew its power. To reverse cause and effect, making it so that concept of a man thrusts his spear, shifts into the enemy was stabbed, therefore the spear must have struck. Death would come at an instant. It aims at the heart. The spear in mind would not expend much energy, nor would it release a pressure too overbearing. He'd given Yamamoto a chance, but the man simply refused to take it. A red thorn. The barbed spear. He called for it within his mind, and it responded. Wave upon wave of bloodlust exuded off of him as he willed the spear to form. Yamamoto instantly grew weary, the hands holding onto the hilt of his sword growing clammy. His shoulders tensed up, and his breathing evened in preparation. The remains of his Haori billowed in the sudden wind that Shiro produced. At the instant that Shiro resolved himself, a distinct pattern of the winter Daphne formed above the sky, seemingly tearing a rift. Yamamoto's complexion brightened immediately as the sounds of multiple instruments playing began to resound in the dimension. They were coming. 4. 5. Shiro could feel the arrival of powerful individuals through the fluctuations in the air. His expression darkened at the realization that they would not be easy to deal with. Just one of them alone seemed capable of contending against him in his weakened state without his reality marble to rely on. His gaze turned sharply to the forming symbols in the air. One-on-one he had confidence in dealing with them, but against so many at the same time, it would be risky. He had to stop it. They had not yet arrived. Moreover, if he were defeated, what would happen to all those that had followed him? They would die. That realization was all he needed to take action. He was a sword, the strongest of all. Cold, unfeeling, blood born from fire. The greatest ability of a sword was not in its form or in its make, but in how it was used. Each sword served a different purpose, each sword able to carve its own path in the world, and he was a sword that wished to save all. Baragan. The name echoed through the air unimpeded. They'd fought with each other numerous times, exchanging blows while simultaneously deepening their understanding of one another. If Shiro could feel the strength of the five approaching, then Baragan with his capabilities as a god king could as well. They would work together, no longer as enemies, but as rivals. Down below in the midst of fighting, Baragan halted in his pursuit of Shunsui and stared up into the air. He knew what it was that was being asked of him, and that was all that mattered. Trace, on. Power swelled around Shiro as his magic circuits flared to life. A combination of spirit, soul, and magic, melded into one. What was it that made up a legend? A myth? An epic? It was the various feats attributed to the heroes of old. Weapons that could slay monsters. Weapons that could shatter mountains. He had them all stored within himself. In a single thought, he unleashed them upon the world, pointed up towards the forming rift created by the emergence of the Winter Daphne. The strength of crystallized legends hailed entirely from the myths of their descent. The greater the feat, the stronger the weapon, and yet there was one more factor that could not be ignored. Time. The breath of death, Respira. From his position down below, Baragan unleashed a dense cloud towards the numerous weapons Shiro had produced. With age came legend. Weapons that were timeless only grew stronger with the passing of the years, never growing brittle or old. This was the truest sense of what was known as a noble phantasm. With time, even the most common of noble phantasms could become strong. As soon as the purple clouds made contact with the noble phantasms above, a reaction like none had ever seen occurred. It was the light of a night sky. Amidst the black, amidst the shadows of Respira, light shone from within, growing in radiance with each passing second like the birth of new stars. Along with it came numerous auras. Holy. Demonic. Merciful. The legends attributed to the weapons above grew in magnitude to the point that even the most trivial of them could not be ignored. This was the strength of the Vasto of White. The Shinigami stared up in shock while the Arrancar watched in fascination as the two rulers of Hueco Mundo revealed the power of their abilities combined. One of creation, and one of death. Shiro opened and closed his palm, willing the swords forward. The stars shone brightly, dazzling all in their splendor. It was only after Yamamoto and the other captains noticed the target of Shiro's attack that panic swelled within them for the first time since the battle began. Every single noble phantasm that had formed was pointed directly at the emerging gate created by the Winter Daphne. If the members of the Royal Guard could not descend, then there was truly no one else that the Shinigami could rely on. Stop him! The shout resounded in the minds of all. Chapter 42, Sword and Soul, Part 5. Darkness and Light. Good and Evil. Inconsistencies existed everywhere and not all things appeared as they seemed, similar to the blurriness of turbid water over a still lake. When rippled, only the tiniest glitters of light could be seen reflected off of the surface, and even then, within the darkest of waters on a tranquil night the moon's reflection existed. No matter which side one allied themselves with amidst the battle, all participants had their reasons to fight, and Shiro knew his clearly. There was both a goal and an answer waiting for him above in a place that no ordinary soul could go. However, this was all the more reason for him to continue striving. It was in search of a reason for his existence in this world. The hollow shell that he called his life as a hollow would have no other meaning otherwise. He did not strive for power. He did not strive for ambition or a greater purpose. The inner part of himself already knew that this was the consequence of burying the ideals that had truly made him who he was, and in retrospect, he still had his doubts. Was it worth it? Was it necessary? Nevertheless, such questions didn't matter anymore simply because his actions had saved millions of already tormented souls. They were called hollows, souls that had fallen into despair and preyed on the innocent. Shinigami were said to purify them, to bring them back to the process of reincarnation and back to the cycle of life and death through Kinso, but did that process fill the void? Souls only became hollows due to lingering feelings of despair and attachments. Simply sending them to the Soul Society as done by the Shinigami did not mean that they were saved. It only meant that they were placed back into the balanced cycle of the spiritual world. The best example was the poor conditions of the Rokanga which surrounded the lands outside the walls of the Siraidai. There were no laws there, and the souls were left to fend for themselves in poverty. Those with higher spiritual energy would starve on the streets and be forced to make a living. Rather than salvation, Shinigami Kinso was more akin to delaying the problem and putting it off. Worse, souls could die within the Rokanga before the process of reincarnation. Hollows were already tormented souls. Reducing them back into a state of weakness and them leaving them to fend for themselves within the streets of the Rokanga was not saving anything. Hollows were still souls. Just because they were different from other souls, didn't mean that they were necessarily evil. The stronger a hollow, the more intellectual it became, as if the soul was no longer controlled by base primal instincts to feed. This was the reason why no Ajicha's level hollow or greater ever ventured to the human world even after Hueco Mundo's creation. Hollows were always considered enemies to Shinigami, humans, and Quincy. If some aspect of good still remained within hollows, then who would save those souls? Images of the scenes that Shiro had seen in his memories flashed across his mind one at a time. Coyote, the hollows, the fear, the hiding, and most of all, the emotions that were slowly regained, none of it denoted the actions of a monster. From animal-shaped hollows, to human forms, the very evolution of hollows revealed what was truly happening. Animals? Beasts? So why then did they look and feel so utterly human? Shiro closed his eyes, recalling the very convictions that allowed him to reason with the actions he had taken back then. He had remembered who he was. His name was Shiro Emiya. The boy who lived through a cursed flame whose heat deprived him of his mind and soul, leaving nothing left but a hollow body. What purpose did he have in ending up in a world far different from his own in the quiet town of Fuyuki? It was enough. Even if he did not know what it was that he'd find at the end of his path, right now, he knew what wanted to do. No longer was he just fighting for himself, but for the hollows who fought along with him for his sake. He would not let them die. What Shiro didn't know was what purpose his presence in Hyuko Mundo had been serving. A void existed within every hollow representing the feelings and sentiments that they had lost in their hollowification. Slowly but surely, that void had been closing the longer that they spent in the Vasto of White's lands and near Shiro himself. The stronger they became, the smaller the individual voices, and the smaller the void. He had to work harder. Just a little more. He already had a rough estimate of how much power was required to shatter the transportation Kido before him. The only problem was that he became the target of all the Shinigami's attacks. He stood at the center while projecting his swords up into the air. Baragan was near him and continuing to send a steady supply of his purple miasma despite Shunsui's interference. "Go, it's enough," he spoke to Baragan while directing the entirety of his focus on his projections. The power exuding from the transportation Kido was palpable. It wasn't enough to threaten Shiro, but he was far more concerned about everyone else. Therefore, he would destroy it. Destroy the Kido so thoroughly that there would be nothing left. Baragan eyed him for a moment, before wordlessly inclining his head and chasing after Shunsui. Meanwhile, Shiro took a deep breath. Just a little bit more time. Stop him. Scorching flames that burned with the fire of an inferno raced towards Shiro, followed by hundreds upon hundreds of attacks. Lightning, ice, wind, swords, the Shinigami spared no expense while spurred on by Yamamoto's order. No matter if the Shinigami were facing an enemy before them or not, they aimed their attacks in only a single direction. Shiro's expression remained neutral. He could endure it. The extent of damage that he'd sustained from the Shinigami's attacks weren't enough to put him down. Although injury was possible, when he compared the value of himself over the value of all of those that he cared about, then it was a small price to pay. Still, Shiro didn't understand it yet, but he was already a pillar from the perspective of the hollows who followed him. He was their leader. Their Vasto of White. The hollows in the lands of the Vasto of White would not stay idle. Everywhere, gazes shifted no matter on which part of the battlefield. Haribel pulled away from a group of Shinigami attacking her. Apasai, Mila rose, Sung Sun forced back the seated officers around them. Kyan Araniro stopped avoiding the persistent woman chasing after him since the beginning of the battle. Grimjo grunted while swinging fresh blood off of his sword. No matter where, hollows were staring up at the sky and at the attacks that the captains and Shinigami had launched towards Shiro with bloodshot eyes. Espada! A rallying cry sounded through the air. When the hollows in the land of the Vasto of White had first transformed into Arankar, several had not been simple Ajichas, but on another level entirely fostered by the spiritual energy of innumerable swords. The greatest form of hollow. Vasto Lords. It didn't matter where they were on the battlefield. The strongest of the army of the Vasto of White paused and concentrated towards the sky. They understood what was being called upon them with clarity. In the entirety of the spiritual world, it was not the Shinigami nor Quincy who were known to possess the most devastating of abilities. That title and achievement belonged only to hollows, the most corrupt and destructive of spiritual life forms. Nails ripped into the flesh of hardened skin and drew blood. It was a meshing of spiritual energy and the blood of a soul. The power of a Grand King, spiraling in the form of lightning upon formation. A deep buzzing noise reverberated throughout the entire dimension, suffocating in the sheer pressure exuded. Bursts of light varying in color erupted in pillars that reached towards the heavens. Red, blue, cyan, azure, emerald, it was the sound of whirring power reminiscent to the thrum of accelerating photons, lasers. They who were kings. They who had the right to look down upon the hollows of Hueco Mundo as greater hollows. Take this blast, and make it whole. A consolidation of the ferocity of a hollow's spiritual energy, and the control of a Shinigami's refined Ryotsu made from the merging of the two powers. Fingers bent, palms pointed upwards. Spiritual energy gathered into distorted spheres. Reduce all to zero. It was a power that bordered on sheer annihilation using the gathered and condensed malice of a hollow. The means of a king. A doom blast greater than any other using the lifeblood of a hollow's spiritual essence itself. Get away. The Shinigami gave their warnings to those nearest to Haribel and the rest, but by then there was nothing left to be done. It happened simultaneously. Arms pointed upwards, blinding light flashed throughout the dimension in response to the attacks that the Shinigami had launched prior. Like the ebbing of a tide of ocean water, the waves drew back, and then returned forth with the strength of an even greater tide. Gran Rey Zero. The Grand King's Zero. It was an attack that could level the entirety of Los Nakas in Hueco Mundo in a single blow, and yet this time, it was performed by the hands of many. The world was shaking. The energies impacted together all at once, intercepting the path to Shiro. The numerous attacks that the Shinigami had sent collided with the power of the Grand King's Zeros in a battle of dominance. One side pushed heavily against the others until in the end, both energies dissipated into particles of spiritual energy. Fragments of swords and weapons that the Shinigami had willed to attack, scattered everywhere and raining down like hail. Fuck, Karen covered her face with her arms from where she stood in the section of the battlefield that Ichigo alone had rendered inactive. The pressure from the clash of energies was too strong to be easily contained, and the shockwave had traveled faster than anyone could have had been able to react to. Fractures were forming over the four towers stabilizing the fake dimension of Karakura Town, causing the lieutenants guarding the towers to inwardly panic and grimace. If the dimension shattered and the battle was brought directly into the human world, then the damage would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, the resulting clash of energies caused wind to whip violently in the air, forcing back several Shinigami and Arankar. For Neliel Tuadolshwank, it was different. She didn't even bat an eye as the winds assailed her, rather she continued to weakly lift her arm up. Out of all the other Vasto Lord-class hollows that had become Arankar, it was only her that had been too fatigued to contribute an attack. Even now, a pink sphere was uselessly trying to form over her palm while fading in and out. Damn it! She pursed her lips to prevent herself from swaying, her vision somewhat blurred until she shook her head. It was no use on forming a strong enough zero. Instead, there was a greater and more pressing issue at hand. She could see it. Even though the Shinigami's attacks had been stopped, someone of Nell's capabilities quickly picked up on the fact that Yamamoto was quickly dashing towards Shiro with his sword raised. Of course, Nell wasn't the only one to notice. Haribel, Grimjo, and the rest all saw it and moved to intervene, but mere seconds later, they were instantly intercepted by Captain-class Shinigami. Nell's expression darkened as she looked over the battlefield. Shiro was still up there charging an attack to destroy the teleportation Kido before him. Seijin Komamura still lay on the ground unmoving from when Ichigo had dealt with him, making Nell's area the only place with no captain around to block her advance. Still, she wasn't exactly in the best condition. Unlike Ulquiorra, she did not maintain her high-speed regeneration after becoming an Arrancar and was therefore left in a wounded state after her prolonged clash against Seijin and the other Shinigami with him. She did maintain certain healing abilities, but she'd never resort to using such methods in public. Help him. I have to help him. She didn't believe that Shiro had the ability to block Yamamoto while managing his sword abilities. Move. She bit down on her lips and drew from the near-empty well of spiritual energy that she had left within her. In mere seconds she was soaring upwards. Wind whipped across her face, but she didn't so much as flinch. Her position was optimal. Out of all the Espada, she was the closest to Shiro, making it possible for her to intercept Yamamoto. As for surviving such an encounter against the head commander of the Siridi, she wasn't even thinking about it. Shiro was different. If it was for him, then surely, he could lead the Hollows to something greater than just evil spirits. Don't you dare touch him. Her eyes were like daggers as she focused in on Yamamoto, and yet, there was an obstacle barring her way. Ichigo. From the moment that he had defeated Seijin, all that Ichigo had done was stay in place and only attacked those that attacked others. It was almost as if he was acting like some human world machine. In this case, he was staring directly at her as if in warning. Her speed faltered. Moreover, given her amount of reserves, did she even have enough to reach Yamamoto in time? Her expression darkened into a grimace, but she couldn't just give up. She looked to herself, and then to Ichigo and knew that she stood no chance out winning right now. Alternatively, she could feel it. Ichigo's need to protect. She stared hard at Ichigo, already knowing that the man that she knew had already lost himself to base instinct after his sudden boost in power. An animal. A beast. She recalled her time training alongside Ichigo. This was not how a proud Hollow should be. Vasto Lord fought on their instincts, but it wasn't their instincts that controlled them. She resolved herself while maintaining eye contact with Ichigo. She didn't have enough power to stop Yamamoto. She knew this. But if it was Ichigo? Prove that you're different. It was faith. Something that a Shinigami would never associate with a Hollow. She believed and trusted in the student that she trained. Lady Nell, don't. An Arrancar shouted out from behind her in warning. Many in the area had experienced firsthand the kind of power that Ichigo had. She directly ignored the warning and moved towards Ichigo. Ichigo's gaze shifted towards her sharply. He currently wasn't himself, but she believed that he was still in there somewhere within all of the power. She needed his help, and therefore, she approached him and stopped right in front of him. The area around her became silent, time seemingly coming to a crawl in the second that they spent staring at each other. Suddenly, Ichigo's hand clasped around her neck. The bloodlust and violence held within the golden-colored sclera in front of her was unable to be mistaken. And yet, such a killing machine only acted to protect those around it. This further proved that Ichigo was still there. She just needed to get to him if only for a moment. Make him understand something. If Shiro dies, then there would be no peace. She would not have it. Haribel would not have it. And most certainly not Brands and the other Hollows who were nurtured by Shiro to become strong from day one. I need your help, her voice came out in a low whisper. Ichigo's countenance hardly shifted if at all. Her eyes remained unflinching despite the hand tightening around her throat. You're not this kind of person. From one Hollow to another. They who could understand themselves the best and whose mental strength was the strongest. She was choking from his grip, but rather than struggle, she placed a hand over Ichigo's face and forced him to level his attention entirely on her. If Ichigo's current form could not understand words, then she wouldn't use words any longer. Her mouth opened, and she let out a low and guttural roar. It was the most basic act of communication a hollow knew. Wake up. Control the rage. That was what it meant to be a hollow and not an animal. Howl. Roar up at the sky along with the others because you are not alone. Why did hollows howl? Once in the past, it had been a question worth debating. Howling only attracted attention, and in a time where hollows had been hunted, why did they still howl? Behind Ichigo's terrifying masked visage, something began to shift. His grasp around her neck lightened, and she dropped limp while still continuing to roar. It was like a plague in the ears of the Shinigami. What started with one, suddenly became many, producing a feeling of unity not felt in ages. Indeed, if hollows were called animals, then surely, they were not meant to be alone. Howl. Howling. The call of hollows. A shudder traveled down the Shinigami's backs. One moment Ichigo was in front of Nell, and in the next he was gone. Up in the air, Yamamoto's sword suddenly shook while held fast within the grasp of another. Yamamoto's eyes widened in disbelief. Ichigo was gripping his sword. What could be seen within those golden eyes was a moment of clarity before another overbearing howl resounded. The sizzling noise of flesh burning resounded in Yamamoto's ears from where Ichigo's hand was making contact with his blade. When looked closely, it wasn't that Ichigo's hand wasn't burning, it was just that the rate of his high-speed regeneration was equal if not greater to the damage that he was sustaining. No matter how much strength Yamamoto put into his arms, Ryujinjaka would not budge. In the midst of his struggle, Ichigo deftly pushed and forced Yamamoto back. Standing in place, Ichigo did not move to pursue, but it was clear that he would attack any that attempted to get past him. Nell sighed in relief while seeing this. She'd been able to convey what her words had not been able to say. Yamamoto would not give up so easily though, but he was forced to dodge from the side as several rapid beams of blue Zero shot towards him courtesy of a gunner down below. In the meantime, Shiro looked like had completed his preparations. Rings of energy seemed to pulsate outwards from each noble phantasm that Shiro had traced in the air. Up in the sky, Shiro took a breath while concentrating. Aged by Baragan's power, the noble phantasms that he had traced carried unimaginable strength. A single low-ranked noble phantasm now had the ability of 2 to 3 grades higher. The time to attack had come. Synchronization complete. Analyzing the base structures, completed. All projections, stand by. His eyes narrowed over the teleportation Kido in front of him. The energy coming off of it had grown to a point that indicated that whoever was using it was moments away from arriving. Instinct warned him that the newest enemies would be able to harm him. In comparison to Yamamoto, they were several leagues stronger. Worse, he was weaker from how he'd been in the past. The only way that he could deal with such people was either to prevent them from coming, or leading them to a place he called his own. Right now, he didn't wish to fight more than he had to. He raised a hand, and each noble phantasm in the air pointed in a single direction. All projections. No. A desperate cry rang out. Successive fire. A deep rumbling overpowered all other noise as the noble phantasms shot forth in rapid fire. They were like stars, glittering in the explosions that they produced. With each sword that struck the transportation Kido, the symbol of the winter Daphne began to dim until it was non-existent. Under the constant bombardment of attacks, the transportation Kido shattered under the eyes of all of the Shinigami. Yamamoto's complexion whitened while the other Shinigami fell into hushed silence. The Shinigami's morale was plummeting at a staggering rate. Baragan alone was terrifying enough, but now that they knew that reinforcements weren't coming, a majority of the weaker Shinigami became severely disheartened. If nothing else, Shiro hoped that Yamamoto would give up at this point. Further conflict was not worth taking any more lives. Shiro's eyes suddenly narrowed. He could feel that something was different. Smoke and lingering spiritual energy covered the area, making it difficult to see or sense anything, and yet, he was growing weary. Something was wrong. As the smoke gradually cleared, Shiro's eyes dilated as he gradually looked down towards his chest. 3 blades had pierced through him. Moments before Shiro had unleashed his attack, Starkey sighed in exasperation before shifting his gaze to Lilynet carried in his arms. She hadn't been the same annoying brat that he was used to knowing in the previous days, and it was clear that she had begun brooding. "He needs help," he said softly while dodging the attacks of nearby Shinigami. Lilynet didn't respond. It wasn't as if he couldn't understand Lilynet's feelings, but avoiding the problem didn't mean that it wasn't there. Hard as it was to admit, the familiarity both Starkey and Lilynet felt in Shiro's spiritual energy made it feel as if something was hammering from inside of them. "He's back. That's him." Words whose meaning they couldn't understand would constantly fill their minds at his presence, making them unable to think nor approach Shiro lightly. "We need to help him," Starkey reasoned. Lilynet glanced up at Shiro in the sky and bit down on her lips. "But we haven't figured out what's going on with us yet. What if we became a burden on Shiro?" Starkey sighed. "We wouldn't have consulted with Aizen if we didn't want to return to our peak state and stand by Shiro's side. Moreover," Starkey's eyes narrowed murderously at Yamamoto. "That man pisses me off." Lilynet readily agreed. From the moment the war began, Starkey and Lilynet's attention either remained fixated on Shiro or Yamamoto, and disregarded everything else. It was for this reason that no captain-class Shinigami attempted to attack them in the least. Starkey was controlling his spiritual output, making him seem far weaker in comparison to Haribel and the others. In this way, the low and mid-ranked Shinigami that attempted to attack him were unable to even touch his or Lilynet's clothes. Starkey's level of strength was too high for them to even fathom, let alone defeat. Seeing the wave of attacks that the Shinigami were sending towards Shiro, both Starkey and Lilynet finally grew serious. "Starkey," Lilynet's tone was firm. "Let's do this." Starkey nodded listlessly while observing Haribel and the others launching their attacks in response to the Shinigami. "Kick about, Los Lobos." Starkey immediately released his resurrection. He could be lazy at all other times, but for some reason, when it involved Shiro's well-being, the urge to take action was utterly overwhelming. He became serious in seconds. Family. That word echoed in both Starkey and Lilynet's mind at this moment. Lilynet's body shifted into particles of spiritual energy which took on the form of a pair of Western-fashioned pistols as a familiar gray and white coat appeared over Starkey's shoulders. Starkey's spiritual energy swelled, scaring away all the low and mid-class Shinigami that dared to attack him. "Starkey, that bastard's moving," Lilynet's voice sounded out from one of the guns. "I know," Starkey eyed Yamamoto's figure. In wake of the Gran Ray Zero that Haribel and the others had fired, Yamamoto was now taking action to strike at Shiro, who couldn't properly defend himself. "It's his fault. It's all this bastard's fault." A voice rang in both Starkey and Lilynet's souls. "He took away my only family. I was alone again." Anger, regret, misery, the emotions were so acute that it hurt. Loneliness. The despair found in solitary silence. And then suddenly, Starkey and Lilynet stiffened. They could hear it echoing first with Nell and then to the rest. The howls. Images of a bright moon continually flashed within their minds, along with a soul figure staring up into a starless night while leaning her back by the entrance of a cold mountainside cave. A lone wolf, uncaring, and unfazed, holding undisputed power. The benchmark of what was first known as the highest Great Hollow. Starkey flinched, his left hand pressing itself over his face as a numbing pain assailed him. He stumbled on his feet, Lilynet feeling no different and releasing a groan from her mouth. The Shinigami around Starkey and Lilynet thought that they saw a chance and attacked. They thought wrong. A gun leveled itself in their direction, and an azure blast stronger than any attack Starkey had ever launched before annihilated them. In their released form, spiritual energy was violently coursing through their bodies. It was almost instinctual. "I wasn't strong enough. I couldn't protect my family." Starkey and Lilynet's eyes became bloodshot as they fought their dizziness and looked up at Yamamoto. "I woke up, and then he was gone." Starkey felt a massive surge of spiritual energy building up at the tip of his gun, suffused with a combination of a light green aura and a deep blue. Starkey and Lilynet's anger felt irrational, but from the moment that they noticed Ichigo repel Yamamoto's advance, they fired without hesitation, almost vindictively. Yamamoto was forced back, giving Shiro the time that he needed to complete whatever attack he had been preparing. Stark felt the impulse to keep firing, but his aim was deteriorating, forcing him to hold his fire. Memoirs kept appearing in his mind one by one. Each new edition had both him and Lilynette struggling to process everything. Their minds blanked, and by the time that they composed themselves and looked back up to assess the situation, they saw three figures stabbing swords through Shiro's chest. Stark and Lilynette froze. Something seemed to snap inside of them. No. No. Not again, please not again. It hurt. The loneliness within them became utterly unbearable. The howling from earlier had yet to die down, the sound ringing clearly in their ears. It was almost as if things had returned to the way that they had been in a distant past. Will you just stand there and watch? The voice within them sounded urgent now, stronger. Family. Family. A shuddering breath was released. Los Lobos. The wolves. Above all wolves valued companionship. They hunted in packs. They lived in packs. Bite one, you incur the wrath of the whole. The first time that a lone wolf howled at the moon, it was in the company of another who it cherished dearly. A treasured companion, for the lone wolf was no longer alone. Stark. Lilynette. The meaning of those names were the two most important people that a single lone wolf cherished in the final episodes of her lifetime. No more. I won't lose anything else anymore. Unimaginable power swelled around Stark and Lilynette to the point that all combatants on the battlefield stopped. To Yamamoto it was a familiar presence, for the rest, all of their mouths suddenly dried. The force was crushing. This power, it killed and killed even without the user's intentions. Right now, that power was needed. For if it could save only one while forsaking the rest, then the rest didn't matter. Family. That word rung again within Stark and Lilynette's minds. An urge exploded out from within them, carrying a will and desire greater than any other. The aspect of solitude, and the desperation to no longer drown within it. You are me and I am you, so as before, howl. It was a signal. Just as he had done for her, and her for him. Them against the world. Howl. Howl at the bright moon. Resurrection, segunda etapa. Lobo Lorando. Crying Wolf. Chapter 43, Sword and Soul, Part 6. It was almost unprecedented how enraged the Hollows became at the sight in front of them. The former Vasto Lords in particular were infuriated, their powers swelling out uncontrollably in pillars of resplendent color. The fool who had stated that Hollows were no more than mindless killing machines created perhaps the worst misconception. Hollows themselves were created from dark manifestations of lingering attachments found within all souls. They were emotions. Fierce. Loyal. Creatures of instinct. Unable to voice the full depth of their grief and fury, they expressed themselves in the only way that they knew how. They went berserk. Get out of my way. Haribel, ever composed, finally lost it. She didn't know what sort of emotion or drive that she was feeling, but she no longer cared. Her hands were trembling in agitation, and it was nigh impossible to calm herself. Her shark fin blade changed targets from one of the four pillars of the dimension towards the battle zone in the sky. She knew that sacrifice was inevitable in war, but in this instance, she refused to tolerate it if it meant sacrificing the only Vasto Lord that she ever respected. Apasai, Mila rose, and Sung Sun followed right behind. Everywhere, similar scenes were occurring. Nell dragged herself back up onto her feet despite Oriamina warning her not to leave in her condition. Grimjo clicked his tongue while switching priorities. Even the dark murkiness of Baragan's spiritual energy flickered dimly before rapidly expanding in size in order to surround Shunsui and end this farce of a game. The rest were no better, but their one-sided intentions were only making it easier for the Shinigami to intercept and mount a defensive. Dragons of ice and snow soared through the air, followed by hundreds of defensive and restrictive Kido spells. Only Ulquiorra was staring intently at a particular direction. Tensions were running high, and despite the chaos of the battlefield, Shinji Hirako felt like he could focus on nothing else but the sword that he had stabbed through the leader of the Hollows in front of him. Kisuke had placed this particular enemy with an even greater importance than Aizen. There would be no defeating Aizen if this enemy wasn't first dealt with or neutralized. Shinji was the leader of a group known as the Wizard, former members of the 13 court guard squads that had been forced to resign due to Aizen's hollowification. Shinji Hirako was the former captain of Squad 5, and beside him were his fellow former captains, Love Ikawa and Kensei Meguruma. Shinji blinked his eyes and took a breath. After witnessing the kind of power and capability that the Vasto of White possessed, he had really thought that Kisuk was sending them to their deaths. However, it would seem that they had somehow come out alive and well. A little luck must have had been involved. At the very last moment before Shinji and his comrades had attacked, Shinji was certain that they had been noticed. Still, thank goodness that he, Love, and Kensei had been fast enough. Listen here, and listen well. I can only provide you all with a single chance. Failure means we won't be able to catch him off guard again. Shinji could still picture Kisuk's absent-mindedness while explaining a mission that meant life and death. However, after Kisuk had adjusted the bucket hat over his head and narrowed his eyes, it was only then that Shinji had felt the true weight of the task. The Vasto of White is strong. Terribly so, such that if this were a video game, I'd call him broken to the point that it's unfair, but I digress. Since the start of his appearance, I've begun my own research and have recently developed a breakthrough that I want you all to test out due to the urgency of the situation. Of course, I can't guarantee what will happen to you if this fails though. So, tough luck. All the best. I'll pray for you. Your efforts won't be wasted. Smug bastard. It wasn't as if Shinji and the others could refuse anyway, but the swords that Kisuk had developed were quite unique. If an Arrancar's natural defense, their steel skin or arrow, was this simple to bypass, then Shinji really couldn't believe it. Even more so that it had pierced through the defenses of what was probably the Arrancar with the strongest arrow present on the battlefield. The swords were plain in appearance, but they were oscillating with a distinct frequency that radiated a sublime sort of radiance that worked to purify the natural malefic energies of a hollow. In the Vasto of White's every appearance, the data shows that there have had been noticeable shifts in the spiritual energy around him. Shinji could recall that Kisuk had raised up a single finger in his past musing. More accurately, something within the Vasto of White himself was causing these shifts. I tried to trace it back to any known source, but could not find anything even closely related unless I wasn't looking in the right location. I eventually found a half answer. A hypothetical situation that even I find difficult to believe. If these swords work, then that just means that I'm finally looking in the right direction. Kisuk didn't exactly explain to Shinji what exactly the swords did, but that was beyond the point. It was from Shinji's own understanding as a previous captain of the 13 court guard squads, that he could tell that rather than just damage the Vasto of White, the swords acted to pull out what was already inside. This was to say, that the radiance that was purifying the hollow energy of the Vasto of White, came from the Vasto of White himself. What the hell are you? Shinji muttered under his breath. His bowl-shaped blonde hair was forcibly lifted from the sheer energy being outputted. The kind of power that he was feeling right now was nothing close to evil, but rather, it was a calming blue akin to a gentle warmth on a spring's day. Shiro did not respond. It was more like he was talking to himself in a daze. Then again, it didn't matter. The chance had come. Directly after stabbing him with these swords, the Vasto of White will be in his most vulnerable state. You won't get another chance. Shinji released the grip that he had on the sword that Kisuk had made and then promptly drew forth his own blade. His Zanpakuto was located within the sheath hung at his waist, tied to his belt, securing his black jeans. Kensei and Love followed suit. It actually worked. Love was sweating, his forehead covered in a translucent sheen. Kisuk isn't always the most trustworthy, but he really does pull through when it matters. Kensei merely grunted, a man of action rather than words. Shinji loosened the purple striped tie around his orange-colored dress shirt. There wasn't much time and the hollows, now Arrancar, had entered a mad frenzy. The bloodlust Shinji could feel directed on his back was no laughing matter. It was like a phantom shark was already biting down on his heels, one that was so ferocious that he really did not want to deal with it. It would be worse than Hiyori on one of her mood swings. Fortunately, a Kido barrier formed through the hands of another colleague manifested to intervene, Hachigen Ushoda, former lieutenant of the Siridi's Kido Corps. Strike. Shinji gave the call. As former captains, Shinji, Kensei, and Love would not waste an opportunity. They glanced once at Yamamoto's direction and hardened themselves as Shinji gave the signal for the rest of the Vizard to take to the battlefield. The enemy of an enemy was a friend. They weren't fighting for the Siriti that had cast them out, but for personal reasons. Moreover, Ishine had asked for their cooperation in regards to Ichigo. Shinji lowered his head while clicking his tongue. The Dembrat Hyori and the others had gone to intercept Ichigo in hopes of somehow getting Ichigo to take control of his hollow and therefore form a mask. In the meantime, it was up to Shinji, Love, Kensei, and Hachigen to deal with the Vasto of White. Yamamoto would owe them a favor, and that favor was a rematch against Aizen. In a flash, Shinji, Love, and Kensei struck out. In hindsight, the Vasto of White really was more a monster than what Kisuke made him out to be. Sparks clashed in a blaze of fiery yellow as swords manifested to block the initial strike. They formed from the ether, streaks of blue taking shape and form first from aligned basis, and then into reality. Not yet. I won't fall here. Shiro had a hand placed over his face. His brows were furrowed, and creases lined his forehead. Shinji noted that Shiro was visibly trembling. Whatever those swords were doing, it was working to stunt Shiro's capabilities. The Vasto of White's power is reminiscent in a way to a Quincy's. First, he gathers spiritual energy and condenses it into a malleable building block which he then gives form likely by imbuing a different kind of spiritual power. I'd call it magic, but it might just be something unique about this Lord of Hollows. Regardless, all Quincy, and most likely the Vasto of White himself need concentration to form their weapons. I assure you that he will not be able to focus with these swords stabbed into him. Liar. Shinji, Kensei, and Love were forced back by a wave of pure spiritual energy. Shinji grunted, but stared out in observation. Whatever Shiro had just did, it was perhaps the most that he could do at the moment because he began plummeting down from the air. Attack. This would be their only opportunity to fatally wound the Vasto of White. Anyone could see it. Between Shinji, Kensei, Love, and Hachigen was the closest. Hachigen didn't specialize in offensive-type Kido, but that did not mean that he did not know any. Hachigen was a portly man wearing an oversized green suit, but he had always been dependable. His left arm pointed forward while simultaneously maintaining the Kido barrier in front of him. Hands unable to touch the darkness, and hands unable to reflect the blue sky. There existed a road that basked in light along with wind that ignited past embers to burn. Without hesitation, without doubt, they scatter brightly and cleanly in the ether. Hado, the way of destruction. Senjukuten Teiho. Heaven's bright cannon. 10 pink energies hovered around Hachigen's hand before directly shooting out in tandem with Shiro as their focal point. The hollows began to howl. A deep howl whose sentiments were impossible for a Shinigami to decipher. Desperation. Anger. Loss. Grief. Howls whose meanings differed altogether blended into one. And in the midst of all the howls, one overtook the rest, prolonged and overbearing. It echoed, loudly, clearly. It spoke of a tale of solitude and loneliness. In the years one spent alone, finally finding another's company was worth more than any treasure. The bonds that were once shared, the trust, the warmth of presence, it all came down to a single motivation. Wanting. Fulfillment. A wish. So, cry out at the moon. Resurrection, segunda etapa. Lo Bolerando. Crying wolf. The words echoed across all of the Arrancar's ears, drawing forth a mix of disbelief and wonder. In the next moment, the world trembled. In the distant city obscured by towering buildings, the wolf howled towards the sky under a vortex of dust pulled up from the ground. How many years had it been? How many years had she been looking, grew discouraged, and then lost hope? There had once been a single hollow with enough power that it single-handedly received a designation as the greatest of great hollows. The first Vasto Lord of 1,000 years prior. The clacking of heels began to echo out before the muzzle of a gun manifested through the smoke. It was a single firearm, plain and bone-like, and yet the sight of it caused Yamamoto to immediately open his eyes in recognition. If the Vasto of White had survived the battle of 1,000 years prior, then what had happened to the other? The answer was right before Yamamoto's sight. Hachigen, Shinji, Kensei, and Love only felt a slight breeze before a figure appeared and seamlessly caught Shiro's falling form just as Hachigen's attack landed. Heaven's Cannon was a high-class Hado spell that resulted in a devastating explosion, but that explosion never came. The petals of the cannon simply paused in midair, unable to detonate nor break free of the spiritual pressure holding them in place. Tufts of silky brown hair blew in the gentle breeze, a familiar gray overcoat lined with silver fur at the sleeves and collar blowing backwards. The first release brought 2 back to 1. The second release returned power to the origin. Bands of tendril-like spiritual energy hovered around her as if an ammo magazine connected to her gun. By her feet, spiritual energy took on the shape of wolves that quickly stood beside her. Coyote Gingerbuck. Only remnant pieces of Stark's previous attire clung onto her body, her pants mottled with tears, and her upper shirt cut at the navel. Haribel and the others stared at her in confusion, none having ever seen her before. However, the distinct headpiece that Lilynet always wore was visibly on Coyote's head, a part of it covering Coyote's right eye. A marksman. Coyote was never a talkative individual. This aspect of her had reflected on Stark, who was always lethargic and generally uninterested in anything else but sleeping. Lilynet was the aspect of herself that had always wanted to be carefree but was always repressed behind a silent exterior. Both of them together formed Coyote. In which case, the fact that Stark and Lilynet treasured those close to them could only mean that Coyote treasured those dear to her all the more. She exerted more spiritual pressure and directly dissipated the petals of Heaven's Cannon. Oi oi oi, tell me I did not just see that. Shinji quickly raised his guard while calling out in verification to Kensei and Love near him. Hado was the Shinigami art of destruction. Fired from the hands of a Kido master, it had the ability to inflict significant true damage upon an enemy. Sometimes, it was even more lethal than the power of a Shinigami's Zanpakuto. The fact that Coyote had literally just disposed of it as if it were mere garbage showed just how much of a monster that she was. Abort. This was wrong. Kisuke had not briefed them on anyone else with this level of power. As much as Shinji felt that the situation was quickly getting out of hand, he could not lightly order retreat either. In calling for retreat, he would expose their backs. Judging from Coyote's gun, she was a range fighter as well. The act of fleeing may very well benefit Coyote rather than aid them. The situation grew tense in an instant, but with as much weariness as Shinji, Kensei, Love, and Hachigen were placing on Coyote, she wasn't even looking at them. Coyote trembled while staring over Shiro's form. The way that she was holding him conveyed just how much importance she placed on him. The fact that there were 3 swords still lodged through his torso concerned her to no end. Coyote was smart, it was where Stark obtained his battlefield stratagems. She knew that pulling the swords out of Shiro right now may in fact injure him more than he already was due to excess bleeding. In which case, she could only open and close her hands in her agitation. Shiro was barely conscious and she didn't know how to properly hold him. At the very least, she could tell that although the swords had pierced his defenses, the wounds were not fatal. Her lips quivered, the only sign of the storm brewing within her. A powder keg at the brink of exploding. I'm back. The words that she wanted to say. The words that she wanted to hear. Welcome back. They were so close yet so far. She hugged him without speaking before blinking away in an instant to somewhere safe, a spot at the edge of the battle zone and where no one else could reach. She would not let them. She gently put him down, and then, she straightened her back and reappeared by Hachigen, Shinji, Kensei, and Love. Family. They heard her family. Coyote had never been expressive, but perhaps her reticent silence was even more frightening. A layer of frost seemed to cover her features because they were now entirely unfeeling. The tender expression that had once been on her face while carrying Shiro in her arms was gone. Her lips were thinned. Her eyes unblinking. It was a cold fury. The kind that seeped into one's bones. In the distance, Baragan suddenly began to laugh. He too had been a hollow that had existed a millennium ago in the time before Hueco Mundo. Back then, hollows were truly on the losing end of the spiritual world, however, that did not mean that they were weak. In fact, the survivors of that time period could only have had ever been the strongest of hollows that weathered the onslaught of both Shinigami and Quincy alike. In the turbulent time period of 1,000 years past, only 2 hollows had been recognized as Vasto Lord. The highest of great hollows. The Vasto of White who had created Hueco Mundo, and the other Vasto Lord who had eluded pursuit of Shinigami for decades. The lone wolf of the mountains, Coyote Gingerbug. Coyote flicked her hand outward, a finger clipping the groove of a holster and leveling her gun forward in the same instant. In the spiritual world, guns were not considered anything close to the strongest of weapons. In a Shinigami's perspective, they were predictable. Just by judging the trajectory of a bullet and then promptly moving beforehand, it was possible to evade all shots. In which case, guns were rendered obsolete when compared to Zanpakuto, which relied entirely on a user's skill. However, Coyote was different. Just because it was surprisingly difficult to hit a moving target with a pistol, didn't mean that it was any less lethal. Guns were inaccurate, unable to compete with a Shinigami's sword. Who decided that? Spiritual energy began to gather at the tip of her gun's muzzle in seconds. There was no time to react. The moment that Coyote pointed was the moment that she fired, and it was instantaneous as a direct representation of her biting fury. Coyote was different from most. Directly from the beginning she already had power and the means to annihilate all before her. However, it was because of this power that she always ended up alone. Subconsciously, she had constantly been mindful of it, limiting her output to a bare minimum of what was required. Right now, there was nothing holding her back. What reason did she have to use a gun if she could just simply fire a zero off from her hand? The answer was frighteningly simple. Her energy was far too abundant. She needed a medium to focus it all. If a single Vasto Lord's zero was enough to level an entire mountain, then hers was akin to several hundred of them fired at once. She alone was the embodiment of what was truly meant as a doom blast. Gather. The words echoed in her mind while her spiritual energy flooded around her. A wave of pulsating blue light engulfed the area. Once, twice, rings of energy spanning the entirety of the dimension literally congregated at the tip of her gun's muzzle. Condense. A high-pitched static rapidly traveled outward. Many would die. Many did die. Hers was a power that was beyond reason for a hollow born in the human world, but it didn't matter. Her eyes grew sharp with vengeance while focusing on Hachigen. This wasn't judgment, this was retribution. Her first target was verified. Bite 1. You fight all. She was entirely unfeeling. Different from before, Coyote wasn't just a regular Vasto Lord, but she had undergone the same process of becoming an Arrancar. She was now a mix of a Hollow's power and a Shinigami's, and the potential found within that combination was immeasurable. A trace of her blood mixed in with her attack, turning the gathered spiritual energy entirely red. Die. Shinji's eyes immediately widened. Hachigen, move. Coyote sneered. There would be no getting away. Zero. The attack was massive, the vibrations toppling the various buildings around and forcing both ally and enemy alike to distance themselves. Hachigen formed barrier after barrier in front of him in light of understanding that he could no longer retreat or run. However, what did that matter? A fight between spiritual beings was a fight between spiritual pressure. Kido was no exception. Block? Impossible. What happened was that everything in the way was entirely consumed. Fuck. Shinji desperately dashed forward, but there was nothing that he could do. Hachigen could see death coming, but despite it all, he did not give up, and until the end, he continued using his defensive Kido. It was what saved his life. Your enemy is me, Yamamoto intervened. He directly cut into the source of Coyote's Zero with a sword of flame and disrupted the connection. It was still too late. Hachigen. Love was the first to reach Hachigen, but the man had already passed out from spiritual depletion. Worse, Hachigen's arms were gone. Love looked back up at Coyote in rage only to stiffen. What was that? There was just no way. His eyes had to have been playing tricks on him. Shinji, Kensei, are you seeing what I'm seeing right now? No one responded. Yamamoto himself was entirely solemn. Coyote had just fired her attack, but there already formed on the muzzle of her gun, was another Zero of equal power. No, in fact, it was even stronger. Different from before, the entirety of Coyote's attention had shifted onto Yamamoto from the moment that Yamamoto arrived. If one were to ask Coyote who she hated the most, it could only ever be the man in front of her that had ruined everything in the past. If it weren't for Yamamoto, then she wouldn't have had to experience that excruciating feeling of gaining something precious and then losing it in the next moment. It was his fault. Everything was his fault. Coyote's spiritual energy spiked once more. No way, Love mouthed in disbelief, hurriedly falling back after taking Hachigen with him. Shinji and Kensei had little choice but to follow. Yamamoto began to frown. Back off, all of you. Yamamoto drew forth his sword. This enemy is on a level far beyond your own. Yamamoto didn't wait to see if Shinji and the others had heeded his order. Coyote was done just standing still. One moment she was there, and in the next, she was gone. Yamamoto felt a tingle at the back of his neck, and from the twitching of his ear, he could hear the faint clicking of a trigger. I hate you. I hate you. Faint whispers carried in the wind. Coyote was feeling such anger that she could no longer stop the outburst that left her lips. Her disappearance was followed after by a surge in spiritual pressure. Coyote was far stronger than she had been back in the past. Yamamoto had no choice but to withdraw the flames containing Aizen and the others. He could not expend any more of his spiritual energy to sustain the containment. With Yamamoto withdrawing his flame barrier, Aizen, Jin, and Tuan were freed. Shunsui, So iPhone, and the other Shinigami paled at the sight, but mere moments after, a figure appeared to bar Aizen's path. What did you do to my son? Ishine Kurosaki appeared wearing the garments of a Shinigami, much to Karen's surprise. Yamamoto grunted in approval at Ishine's timing. After all, he had to focus. He raised Ryujin Jaka up with both hands. He was the wielder of the first flame, the strongest of fire-type Zanpakuto. The heat in the area began to magnify several folds, causing even those far away to strain under the temperature. However, Yamamoto had no choice but to increase the temperature further in response to Coyote's own spiritual energy. Yamamoto spoke into the air. If you raise your spiritual pressure any more, then you'd risk the lives of even your allies. Coyote appeared in a flash, her gun clashing against Ryujin Jaka. She was expressionless, her countenance set into a frigid glare. She leaned forward. Her power elevated further, her lips parting to speak in monotone. I don't care. She'd always been different from Shiro. Her priorities were entirely one-sided. So long as her family was safe, nothing else mattered. In light of the danger that Coyote posed with her strength alone, almost everyone had lost track of what had happened to Shiro. Of the hollows that wished to aid him, every single one of them was intercepted by a captain-class Shinigami or otherwise. It was then that a particular phenomenon occurred. Kisuke was right in that the swords that he had designed were effective. Too effective, in fact. From the very beginning, Shiro had never been an average hollow. Everything about him was different for the sole reason that he didn't exactly originate from the same world as everyone else. Shinigami, Quincy, and hollows did not exist in his previous world. However, a type of equivalent did exist in place of everything else. Heroic spirits. The spirits of mankind's greatest individuals who had accomplished feats or heroics that went down in myth, legend, or history itself. Each heroic spirit possessed a unique signature or energy known as a spirit origin. In the life of the man known as Shiro Emiya, he had accomplished an achievement thought to be impossible in the modern day of his world. He had become a hero, someone qualified to join the ranks of heroic spirits. He had been known as the Nameless Hero, a figure that wandered the world in its war zones while simultaneously helping all those that were in need. His death, although tragic, was not the end for him. In a twist of fate, his soul had crossed worlds and ended up in the spiritual jurisdiction of the system of the Soul King. He who was meant to become a heroic spirit had instead become a hollow. However, that which made him a heroic spirit was still there, if only just locked away. The swords that Kisuke had created were created not through the standard spiritual energy of the present world, but through the unique spiritual energy that Kisuke had been able to harvest from Shiro himself, the energy of Shiro's own spirit origin that Kisuke had mistaken to be something else entirely. This was why the swords that Kisuk had made had been able to bypass Shiro's defenses. There was no defense to begin with, as the power originally belonged to him. Right now, that power was acting to undo what Shiro had done in the past. To initially create Hueco Mundo, what he had needed to do was distance himself from his core being. He had to shut down the forge, make it barren, empty, and yet doing so was the same as losing what made him who he was. Memory loss. Lack of ambition. He was not allowed to have anything else because it would ruin the balance that he had willingly created. In essence, by becoming a hollow, it was more like he had sealed a part of himself away. Right now, that seal was crumbling away piece by piece. Be a dump. Be a dump. The beating of a heart began to echo within him. He was not just a single soul, he was a world. Fire returned to the origin, beliefs honed through battle manifesting not through the mind, but through the memory of the body. Kisuk's swords acted as keys to reverse what had once been done. A sleeper was beginning to awaken. Energy began to swirl around him in arcs, growing in magnitude and releasing an undetectable energy that quickly spread throughout the battlefield. 1, 2, 10, it quickly and seamlessly made contact with all. Everyone present was similar in that they were all souls. Resonance followed suit, and what appeared before everyone's sight was a world of horrid flame. It wasn't the kind that simply killed with intense heat, but one fraught with a putrid taint. It was a vision of the beginning. The place where everything started, and where a single boy trudged onward while surrounded by the hands of the dead. The Tragedy of Fuyuki City. Chapter 44, Sword and Soul, Part 7a. What was this place? The sky was a deep orange, embers carried within an acrid and ash-filled wind. Heavy smoke suffused the surroundings, a grey almost black-like fog perforating through the cracks and crevices of crumbled buildings and seeping out into the open. Tar bubbled from the heated pavement, mottled with speckled holes derived from the falling debris of towering buildings. Steel infrastructure, marred black and melting, constantly oozed with a sizzling noise and pungent odor. It looked like hell. There was no end in sight. No matter where one looked, the same landscape seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the reflection of a nightmare or tragedy ingrained not within the mind, but within the soul. An origin, the beginning of it all. The time of birth had come. Ashes to embers. From sparks to roaring flames. All that could be seen within this desolate landscape was death. No one had taken notice of it before, but it quickly became apparent. Buried within the rubble, lying dead over the streets, or simply out in the open, bodies lay everywhere. Their skin was burnt black, their bones nothing more than kindle unfit to feed a fire. The slightest touch or movement would be enough to reduce them into a chalky dust. In the entire city covered by a blazing inferno, not a single person in sight was alive. Only the constant hum of crackling echoed endlessly amidst flickering shadows illuminated by a fierce glow. The bodies of the deceased, the corpses of friends, loved ones, and family, all of it all looked the same under the sweltering heat. Their hands were all morbidly held towards a single direction, as if in calling for a savior that did no more than walk past them in their moment of need. There was no hate, nor malice, grief, or envy. Only the destituteness of a hollow feeling. Empty shells without desire. At the sight of tragedy, both Shinigami and Hollow were aware that the souls of the dead would linger in hordes, bound by their soul chains to wander upon the earth due to the suddenness of their deaths. This was different. Piteous souls with nothing left, even the soul itself. What sort of flame was this? The fiery radiance of the tainted fire burning throughout the world felt crippling in the disparate rot. To the Shinigami and Hollows present, the spiritual energy that they could sense throughout the city was appalling in its quantity and might. If one were to take all of the world's evils, store it upon a single host, and then condemn that host to damnation, that level of hatred wasn't something that anyone could lightly handle. This was the power of a Zoroastrian god, Angra Mainyu, of another universe. A power similar to that of the Spirit King, yet infinitely darker and malefic. Coyote only considered her surroundings for a moment, and then thought nothing else of it. The Hollows and Shinigami though were different. The dimension that Kisuk had created was finite. In a sense, they could grasp or feel the boundaries of the world around them, which only encompassed the area of Karakura town. In this case, no matter how far their spiritual senses stretched, they could not feel a boundary that indicated an enclosed dimension. In Kisuk and Aizen's terms, this was an entire world bereft of the limitations of technological reproduction. How? It made no sense. There was no prior warning, nor discernible trigger. The world just suddenly came to be. In another place, and in another time, there was a power known as true magic, miracles and feats beyond recreation. I am, and so it shall be. To force onto reality one's own beliefs and ideals and bend the fabric of space to accommodate. This wasn't considered a true magic, but it was the closest as anything could have had ever been. I am, the world. A hill of swords. A solitary existence. Never bending, never breaking. Because that was all that ever was and would be. So, manifest one's inner reality and make it whole. Fingers twitched in the distance, a figure on the verge of waking. His body was steel. His blood of fire. Remember. This was the end, and the beginning. A deep thrumming resounded, 27 points of energy rapidly swelling in power while gathering the spiritual energy in the air like a vacuum. A breaking point would eventually be reached, and yet until then, the fighting continued. Coyote had not stopped her assault on Yamamoto even once. This was a grudge spanning over 1,000 years. She kicked forward, past the violent streams of fire spewed forth from Ryujinjaka to butt heads directly with Yamamoto. The helmet over her forehead creaked in response, but her expression remained unchanged despite the relative dizziness. Often, the calmer a person appeared in the face of anger, the more furious they actually were. One could call Coyote suicidal for daring to engage Yamamoto in close-quarters combat when her speciality relied on range, but she'd long since accounted for everything. Her muscles were taut, and her senses heightened in preparation. Yamamoto was a master in combat, a monster from a generation of learned killers in the name of order. Hand-to-hand skills, Kido, swordsmanship, he knew it all. Despite butting heads with Coyote, he stood his ground with a light grimace. Just as reckless as you were back then, Yamamoto immediately shifted his grip on his sword and burst out with a sharp spiritual energy. That was the reason for your downfall. No, it was your remorse. The light in Coyote's eyes burned with something fierce. Put aside your anger, and look at where you are. Yamamoto put strength into his arms and began pushing. Your comrades will die if we raise our spiritual pressure any higher. It was ironic coming from Yamamoto, but time indeed changes everyone. He was no longer as merciless as he had been in the past. The number of Shinigami which he had trained and watched grow into strong men and women did much to whittle away at his indifference towards justifying the means. Enough of this. Yamamoto's aura exploded outward. Coyote fell silent in response, but soon enough, not only did her strength not wane, it heightened. An empty laughter devoid of amusement began to echo past Coyote's lips. It was enough to send shivers down one's spine before it suddenly just stopped. Coyote was glaring, the neutrality of her expression breaking as tears slowly began to well up in her eyes and trickle down her cheeks, and yet she had been laughing. It was broken, strained. Alone. She'd never wanted to be alone again. That was all that she had ever asked and hoped for after meeting Shiro. She was content to just live out her life even in hiding if she had to. So long as there was someone waiting for her. A simple welcome back after a strenuous day was enough. She'd nod, sit down by a corner, and relax under the light of the moon with her family by her side. Gone. All of it gone. Wind began to pick up, a gale rapidly pulsating outward with Coyote at the center. The force caused the flames burning within the new world to flicker wildly. Any and all who were touched by the flame, Shinigami or Hollow alike burnt until there was nothing left. Her spiritual energy erupted unabated. A radiant torch. The power that had killed lesser hollows with presence alone. Without Shiro's appearance. Without Aizen's intervention. There had only ever been one hollow at the pinnacle of evolution. The spiritual pressure was horrifying and it only continued to swell, aggregating into the form of a howling white wolf. The power of the first Vasto Lord. Crack, shatter. Visible fractures began to form over the hollow bone fragments still left over Coyote's form. A hand went over to press itself onto the left side of her face, her shoulders trembling. Cry, she would not any longer. After years of solitude within the sands of Hueco Mundo wallowing in despair and grief, she had realized the truth that was most important to her. She indeed had regrets about killing those close to her, and abandoning the hollows depending on her in the mountain pass of old. She was remorseful, and had always kept her emotions bottled up within herself because there was no use in dwelling over the past. However, it had led to her defeat when those suppressed emotions caused her a moment's indecision in battle. The only one that she ever cared for was gone. The regret and indecision plaguing her for her past actions was gone, suffocated under the weight of solitude. No more. Stop. She stared directly at Yamamoto. She'd long since come to terms with herself already. So long as she had just one person that she could rely on, then that was enough. That hell, the loneliness within the white sands of Hueco Mundo had already overwhelmed her once before. It had been unbearable, and now face to face with the cause of it all, he told her to stop. Strength welled into the hand over her face, and in a single action, the helm-like bone fragment over her head crumbled within her grip. The sound was distinct like shattered glass, the aura even more so. Of the hollows that had come to Aizen for aid, Starkey and Lilynet were already at the stage where the Hogyaku's power was useless. They had already begun the process of discarding their masks. My anguish, my misery, my mourning, you would never be able to understand it. An aspect of death. Solitude. A hollow's mask was more than just a mere decoration. It was directly related to their evolution. The stronger a hollow, the more humanoid that they became. As a Vasto Lord herself, Coyote barely had any fragments left of her mask still present on her body. Now though, everything was gone. Her energy swelled, her hair blowing back as her form swayed. The pair of pink-colored eyes that stared at Yamamoto never wavered. Her gun was raised, the design similar to a sleek revolver. Rings of spiritual energy pulsated towards the muzzle and formed into an iridescent sphere of blue. The sheer density of it denoted the sheer explosive capabilities it contained. One shot. One overwhelming attack. It was true that it was difficult to aim a gun amidst a fight, but there came a point in terms of weaponry when accuracy no longer mattered. The Grand King's Doom Blast. Different from the ones that Haribel and the others had once fired, this Zero alone packed everything that Coyote could gather in a single round. To call it a gun would be an understatement. It was a goddamned cannon. The diameter of the growing sphere only continued to expand. Coyote had never replied to Yamamoto's words, but her actions were enough. The ground trembled, the weaker hollows and Shinigami firmly pressed into the earth, visibly straining to breathe. Run. That's not Starkey or Lilynet. It's someone else. Nell called out to all the other hollows. Haribel, Apasai, and all the other Vasto Lords used their spiritual energy to mitigate Coyote's own so that the hollows could temporarily fall back. The Shinigami were no different. Ishin was forced to disengage from Aizen in worry for Karen and the rest who were struggling to remain upright. Worse, the tainted fire burning within the ruined city was dangerous if anyone came into contact with it. The inability to move caused by Coyote's spiritual pressure was proving lethal. It wasn't the end. Forced to face Coyote's attack, Yamamoto's spiritual energy rose in tandem. Aizen, for once in his life, felt like he had no idea what was going on anymore. It was just one thing after another in this battle, and the root of it all came from a sole variable. The Vasto of White. Aizen had yet to share his observations with others yet, but he somehow knew that this otherworldly plane was related to Shiro. In which case, the power of reality which he could feel from within the tainted flames was a power that Shiro possessed as well. Aizen and Kisuk were inadvertently beginning to stumble into the wrong assumption about just what kind of existence Shiro was. For now though, it didn't matter. We're retreating, Aizen gave a curt order. He, Jin, and Tuan Flash stepped to a safer location. The weaker hollows and Shinigami were quick to copy. Shunsui and Baragan stared at each other, before both moving back to their respective camps. Strong as Shunsui and Baragan were, even they would not risk getting caught up in the clash of powers before them. A battle of spiritual beings depended not only on ability, but spiritual energy. The laws of Shunsui's games would be fundamentally denied in the case of an overpowering might. Similarly, Baragan could not rot the spiritual energy fast enough to avoid damage. The confrontation between Coyote and Yamamoto continued. Neither could even begin to evaluate just how many would die after this attack, but Coyote's expression was the only one that remained unmoving. She was doing the right thing. As far as she knew, the only one who could threaten her family's life again was the man before her. Therefore, kill. She had to kill him. Her resolve was set. The finger over the trigger of her gun need only pull and her attack would launch. It was in that moment though that the unexpected occurred. The face that was devoid of emotion and suffused with murderous intent, suddenly faltered visibly. No. It can't be. Coyote's lips quivered, her gaze shaking. The energy that she had built up to use for a single instance almost entirely vanished as if it were never there. Her complexion was pale, and her breath hitched in her throat. She kept shaking her head from side to side in disbelief before growing still and suddenly vanishing into an entirely different direction. Yamamoto blinked in confusion. He was in the midst of activating his Bankai to counteract Coyote's attack, but suddenly had no reason to anymore. He huffed out a weary breath and reeled in his spiritual energy to save the Shinigami too weak to withstand it. Yamamoto could not tell what had happened. Had Coyote continued her attack, he was certain to have had been forced into a perilous situation. Moreover, she looked dead set on fighting it out with him moments earlier. What had changed? The answer was simple. She'd seen a figure just off the edge of her vision. It was small, barely taller than 3.5 feet. She would have missed it any other time, or wouldn't have had cared, but this was different. Wind whipped across her hair and body as she dashed forward towards the figure walking in a limp through the open flames. It can't be. She landed on the balls of her feet, her steps echoing in her ears as she approached the child before her. It was a little boy. One that she wouldn't ever ignore. Stark. She looked at the child walking listlessly in front of her with worry, her voice shaky. There was no way that she could have had fired off her attack. She could feel his presence. She was certain that it was him. It didn't make sense. She swore that she had left him on the edge of the battlefield away from harm. He shouldn't have had been anywhere near where he was now. Moreover, why did his appearance change? Stark, she called out stronger. The boy did not respond and just continued walking. Moreover, she didn't like the way his eyes looked. There was no life there. Nothing to be found of the man who called her family. She reached out to him, grabbing him in her grasp, but still he did not respond. A pit formed in her gut, her mind blanking. Just what was going on here? The others soon took notice of her location and arrived before she could take Stark to a safer area. She glared at everyone in distrust, but relented when her memories from her time as Stark and Lilynet came taut front of her mind. She let Haribel and the others near her, but refused to allow any Shinigami to get close, and this included Aizen. Everyone present who had fought or was acquainted with the Vasto of White could feel that the child in Coyote's arms was one and the same. Back off! Coyote snarled as Yamamoto arrived at the head of the Shinigami. One hand held the child around the waist, and the other hand pressed the child's face to the crook of her shoulder. The wizards were too busy keeping Ichigo occupied so only they were not present in the scene. Of everyone present, no one knew what was going on, but one thing was clear. The Vasto of White did not seem to be in any state to put up a fight. Yamamoto felt his mouth dry, the other Shinigami behind him readying themselves. This chance was like a godsend. All had experienced the power of the Vasto of White in person. They had both seen it and felt it. Sorry, but I don't think we can agree with that. Shunsui was the one who spoke. He had appeared by Yamamoto's side along with Kyoraku and Anohana. Zaraki Kenpeki was not that far off either as well as the other captains. Coyote gritted her teeth, her arms shielding the boy in her grasp like a mother protecting her cub. I said stay away. She looked nothing like the woman whose power could overwhelm almost everyone present. Instead, she was just frantic, no. More than frantic, she was scared, her whole body trembling. She didn't want to lose her family again. The one thing that Coyote had still not understood or comprehended, was that this wasn't the past any longer. There were comrades that would stand by her side. Haribel, Nell, Sung Sun, Baragan, the Arankar, the Espada. She was no longer alone. So, stop making that face. Coyote stiffened as a small hand touched her cheek. The boy's expression was still blank, but perhaps somewhere deep within him, a part of Shiro had reacted. Even if the present world were just but a memory and nothing done inside would change anything, some things were still worth protecting. Dash, I am the bone of my sword. Hidden deep in the distance, monolithic gears gradually began to turn. Chapter 45, Sword and Soul, Part 7b. The battle momentarily ceased, both sides glaring at the other in a tense standoff. Yamamoto's silence and the intensity of the Shinigami's growing spiritual energy were enough indicators of which stance that they were adopting in this situation. They would fight, and that was all. Coyote pursed her lips and took a few tentative steps back. If she ran, she doubted that anyone would be able to catch up to her other than Yamamoto. However, she couldn't. The child in her hands felt weak and moments away from dying. Any strenuous maneuvers or hasty actions could lead to a result that Coyote did not want to think about. Worse, if she didn't maintain a constant blanket of spiritual energy around the child, then the spiritual pressure suffusing the area would crush him faster than any attack ever could. If, and only if she negotiated to retreat and put aside her grudge with Yamamoto, did she really think that Yamamoto would agree? No. He definitely wouldn't. The man was too caught up in tradition and the concept of black and white. Just because one was born into a race of monsters that preyed on the souls of the innocent, did not mean that all could be considered monsters. However, it wasn't as if Shinigami would ever understand that concept anyway. It wasn't that they were incapable of it, but more because they chose not to see or acknowledge it. The vast majority of hollows were mindless in the earlier stages of their evolution, meaning that the Shinigami's ill-placed preconception were not unfounded. Hollows were hated, hunted down by both Shinigami and Quincy alike. If the sole purpose of an entire race of beings was to just be hated and ostracized, then what was wrong in hating everyone back? Coyote's grip around the child in her arms tightened ever slightly. Battle was imminent and the only one that she felt could contend against Yamamoto was her. Little did she expect though that someone else would step forward. As much as I'd prefer to simply observe, I do believe that you've all been ignoring me for long enough. Aizen stepped forward, causing Ishine and the other captain to tense. It won't be much of a partnership, you see, if I didn't have anyone to actually call partner. Now then, Aizen began to grin as his spiritual energy began to rise. Perhaps you are all forgetting that I am not a person so easily overlooked. The ground quaked as a torch-like aura of white spiritual pressure surrounded Aizen's form. It wasn't as oppressive as Coyote or Shiro's, but it was more than capable of contending against Yamamoto's own. None dared to act lightly. Aizen was not someone simple to deal with. However, that didn't mean that the Shinigami would just stand there and watch. Suddenly, a needle pierced through the skin of Aizen's back. Sting all enemies to death, Suzumbaki, so iPhone's expression was ruthless, her eyes narrowed and lips thinned. Aizen, you bastard, you were careless not to pay attention to your surroundings. So iPhone was not one to waste actions over words. In the time that she used to speak, she'd already struck a second time in the exact same location where the markings of a black butterfly bloomed. The first attack laid the target. The second strike meant certain death. It was the power of a Zanpakuto worthy of the captain of the stealth force. Aizen's expression never changed despite so iPhone's successful attack. In fact, he looked like he was struggling to suppress his mirth despite blood leaking from his body as Suzumbaki's ability took effect. Oh. He sounded amused while turning to stare at so iPhone behind him. Do you truly believe that I would be that careless? I'll indulge you and allow you to understand the error of your judgment for what the situation really is. So iPhone felt her vision swim. She staggered. Something was wrong. Her heart beat audibly within her chest, her senses screaming at her as the image of the Aizen before her faded into nothing. In the next moment, she felt the chill of cold metal beneath her chin placed along the side of her neck. Tranquil as a lake's water, pristine as a mirror, Aizen's blade shifted dangerously close to piercing so iPhone's throat. Kyuka Suijutsu. Mirror flower and water's moon. Did you forget my Zanpakuto's ability? So iPhone tensed, Shunsui and the other captain grimacing while trying to find a way to reverse the situation. Coyote was the only one who was staring at Aizen blankly. She had no idea about Aizen's ability because she'd never seen his Zanpakuto before. From Coyote perspective, she'd watched as the Shinigami acted like fool and struck air while Aizen merely spectated from a distance. Coyote could feel that Aizen was strong from his spiritual pressure alone, but perhaps more dangerous than his individual strength was the cunning and intellect that she could see in his eyes. The only time when strength surmounted all, however, was in the case of overwhelming power in which no strategy could ever breach. She maintained her weariness against Aizen despite the man calling himself an ally. The visions, thoughts, and sounds one experiences while staring at a reflection are dangerously captivating, are they not? Aizen stabbed So-iPhone in the throat and watched as she backed away while swaying. Her hands were pressed to her wound, but Aizen had made sure to strike at the jugular. Blood spurted out in an arc before So-iPhone fell to the side with a choked gurgle. "See, Captain!" Omada, the lieutenant of Squad 2, shouted in alarm while racing forward. He froze solid the very moment Aizen shifted his gaze on him. Aizen grinned before kicking So-iPhone's body over. "Did you know that slicing open a person's neck does not mean immediate death? However, delay in treating her any longer, and she will die." Omada grew flustered and could only turn to Anohana for aid. Anohana herself wore a grim expression. "You are a treacherous man, Aizen Saoshik," Anohana spoke softly while assessing So-iPhone's condition and keeping her alive through healing Keto. "There's no way to treat this even if there was time." Aizen shrugged and gave a meaningful stare at Oriamenu, who was protected behind Rukia, Chad, Ishida, Karen, and many other Shinigami. "Maybe you just aren't looking at the right place," he commented with little interest. He didn't care if So-iPhone died or not. She was but an example to serve for the others to realize their true predicament. His true strength didn't lie solely on the quantity of spiritual energy, but on the sharpness of his intellect. Was it really him that they were fighting, or maybe it was just the air or a random object? The ability to confuse and deceive was extraordinarily lethal both inside and outside of battle. With Aizen stepping out at this tense moment, none dared to move lightly. This was exactly what Aizen was going for. Rather than just the Soul King, he had long since begun to develop a keen curiosity regarding his fellow collaborator. The Vasto of White. What sort of existence was he really? Aizen looked once more at the new world around him, whose laws seemed to follow a different principal axis, and felt that there was still much that he needed to know. A power like this, was it not on the level of the Soul King himself? Aizen was a scientist. There was no way that he would leave a puzzle unsolved, let alone allow others to skew the results of his observations. "Good. It seems that you all won't be attacking for the time being." Aizen sheathed his sword. "Not like attacking now would do you any good anyway. Have none of you all realized it yet? Or are you all just blinded by a misguided opportunity to deal with the Vasto of White?" Aizen moved back to stand by Jin and Tuan's side before staring at Yamamoto and the others in derision. "Nothing you do here will have any effect on the outside." While everyone had been fighting, Aizen had been experimenting. Although it was true that he could interact with the environment around him, nothing that he did could fundamentally alter it. For example, he'd blasted a crater into the ground and watched in fascination as the damage reverted to an unharmed state. A world in a dream. This was perhaps the most apt description. Or perhaps it was just a memory. Everyone grew confused at Aizen's words, but no one had time to process them for much longer. If the current world truly was just a dream within another reality, then the dream was in the midst of proceeding. Star K. Coyote grew startled as the child phased through her and landed on the ground. The child then began to walk once more, listless and without purpose. It didn't matter if it was Shinigami, Hollow, or humans, the boy directly passed through them as if they were never even there. Moreover, the direction of the hands pointed in the boy's direction. Everything was gradually starting to make sense. "I didn't save them." The tone that reverberated within everyone's ears was flat, almost subdued in its lack of energy. Empty. There was nothing left to feel, to see, or to experience. The tainted flames burnt everything away. There was nothing left, but a hollow feeling. Coyote's breath hitched while everyone else watched in silence. The boy finally collapsed in exhaustion. Parts of his clothing were stained with soot and powdered ash, and the expression of his eyes was vacant while staring at the pale moon above. "Up. Get up." Coyote was by the child's side in an instant, her spiritual pressure forcing back anyone else who tried to approach in an instant. Her hands moved to hold him and shake the child awake, but nothing she did was changing anything. Everyone fell silent. Even if they didn't quite understand what exactly was going on, they weren't ignorant enough to not be able to comprehend that perhaps the current world was a reflection of the human life that the Vasto of White had led. Was this where the Vasto of White had initially died before becoming a spirit? It wasn't the case. The scene shifted, the world of flames turning into nothing more than a blur before clearing up to reveal a distant battlefield. Always alone. Never knowing victory nor defeat. The steady voice continued to narrate in its flat monotone. A man shrouded in a red mantle and surveying the battlefield knocked an arrow over a long black bow before firing consecutively. Humans were fragile creatures. Death, death, and more death. The man killed, looking more like he, himself, was the one dying. However, not once did the man waver. For every individual that he killed, he saved 10, no, hundreds more. It was hell. This wasn't the life that the child who'd survived the flames had wished to lead. Far from it, it was a nightmare in which he had no means of escaping because he was already broken inside. In the end, despite the constant struggles, the justification, and the means that he had employed, he had still been killed and executed by the very ones that he had saved. He did not resist. Not when it felt like everything that he had ever fought for suddenly had no meaning. He was hung by the neck, tied within a body bag, and left to suffocate. Coyote was trembling. The other hollows with relations, either friendly or otherwise to Shiro, were inwardly incensed. By the time it showed the scene of the people condemning the man to death, Coyote had already began firing in her rage. However, no amount of anger can change something that had already once occurred. This entire world was but a memory. A resonance between souls. The startling truth was that in life, the Vasto of White could be considered a selfless hero, neither wanting recognition nor riches. It's not wrong to save others. For a simple reason such as that, he had led a life worse than death pursuing an ideal that was impossible to achieve. The Shinigami did not know what expressions to make. They spoke of honor and duty, and to uphold justice, but what they'd just seen wasn't anywhere close to justice. The Vasto of White had never done anything wrong in his life. Perhaps the betrayal at the end was what drove him to become a hollow? No one had any real answers because the images were moving too fast. At the end of it all, one last scene began to quietly play out. The beginning of a simple wish. Shiro's eyes were closed even as his mind returned to a memory of a single point at the zenith of an evening long ago. A porch overlooking a still pond. The gentle light of the stars shining overhead. The inheritance of a dream, a legacy from father to son. That's what I'll be. A boy looked up towards the moon with eyes that were clear, free of doubt and hesitation. A hand was outstretched, reaching beyond the visible horizon and grabbing onto an unreachable ideal. An ally of justice. This was the final scene that Yamamoto and the others lay witness to with startling clarity. The world began to shift and move before receding back to reveal the dimension of the fake Karakura town. Yamamoto and the others were left baffled at their sudden return, but more than that was another anomaly. They could see it now if only barely, monolithic gears hanging in the distance as if superimposing with the current reality. They were translucent, fading in and out, but they were unmistakably there. Shiro, who had been left by Coyote in the distance, finally began to rouse. The swords that had been stabbed into him were no more, and power flowed freely from inside his veins. Of all the memories that he had to see, why did it have to be that? That's right. That was who he was. An ally of justice. He groggily opened his eyes and made his way to stand on his feet. His head was hurting, a hand placing itself over his face, but he no longer felt any indecision. Did the purpose of his existence in the world matter? There was once such a time that he was obsessed on it after years of inactivity in Hueco Mundo. However, he no longer felt that desire to know anymore. It wouldn't change his course of action anyway. No matter where he was, or what he was doing, so long as he was still himself, then the wrought iron hero would still save those that he could see with his eyes. His hands extended forward as cracks appeared in the dimension of the fake Karakura town. His was the power to create worlds. A means to bend reality to his will. I am the bone of my sword. Chills suddenly spread down Yamamoto's back at Shiro's voice and words. He'd heard this phrase before. He knew it be instinct as a safety precaution ever since the events of the past. The world began to move. Steel is my body, and fire is my blood. Shiro's senses expanded out. It was how he discovered something important. Someone was watching this battle. His expression hardened. Regardless of who won or lost in this conflict, both sides were not expecting a third party. Worse, he could feel numerous energy signatures suddenly entering Hueco Mundo in his absence. Something far more than just a conflict with the Shinigami was occurring at the moment, and now that he could sense it, there was no longer any time to waste. The situation was dangerous, far more than what was being let on over the surface. However, they were taking him lightly. They dared? The sleeper had awakened, and the sword left stuck in its sheath was finally drawn. Intruders to Hueco Mundo in his absence? At a time where the strongest hollows were alongside him no less? Clearly the objective of the intruders was not anything close to friendly. Still. Were they truly that bold? I have created over 1,000 blades. Hueco Mundo was not just any other world, it was his world. His inner reality. To enter it willingly with ill intentions, wasn't that just a death sentence? No matter. He would deal with it himself, particularly because he could sense that the intruders were fairly strong. He looked at Coyote and the others who had risked their lives on his behalf. It was enough. There were too many uncertainties present in this battle, and he wouldn't let anyone die anymore. Unknown to death nor known to life. The world within him threatened to expand outwards, but he couldn't do so just yet. The hollows needed Hueco Mundo. He could not activate his greatest magic lightly, at least not yet. Fall back, his voice was firm as it spread across the battlefield. The suddenness of the order had everyone stunned. Given his current aura and Yamamoto's deathly reaction to his mantra, it could have had only been assumed that he was getting ready for battle. However, only he himself knew clearest about the real situation. He'd been present over 1,000 years ago, and he knew that the Shinigami did not only face hollows at that time. Quincy, he recalled the term that Coyote had used. Right now, he could feel a large number of them moving in places that one could not easily see or sense. Worse, they felt powerful enough to put those that he cared about at risk. The hollows were baffled at his order, but none disobeyed. Aizen was different. Retreat? He asked in perplexity while appearing nearby. His brows were furrowed, and from the looks of it, he'd never approached Yamamoto and the others from the beginning. Kyoka Suijutsu truly was a broken ability. I'm glad that you finally understand the depth of my elegance. Kyoka spoke in his mind. He ignored her and just focused on Aizen. He was smart, so it probably wouldn't take much to convince him. You can't sense them, he said firmly before elaborating further. Who wins in a war? The ones who fight in the light, or those who creep in the dark? Aizen was intelligent enough to fully interpret his meaning. A hint of curiosity appeared over his face before the man fell into quick contemplation. Someone's watching. A third party. Aizen mused aloud before conceding. Very well. I'll trust that you aren't lying to me. Jin, Tuan, we're leaving. Moving away, Aizen, Jin, and Tuan followed after Haribel and the other hollows who had already opened a Garganta back to Hueco Mundo. Coyote trailed behind, clearly unwilling to leave unless she was forced to. She kept looking at him in concern and apprehension, leaving him no choice but to comfort her. I won't leave this time. I promise, he called out to her. Trust me. She hesitated, but in the end, even she too soon left. The others were following one by one. The retreat came suddenly. The Shinigami could hardly believe it, but even more were red-eyed and furious. Baragan, Nell, Haribel, and the others had killed hundreds of Shinigami. Corpses of Arankar and Shinigami littered the area from wherever one looked. Baragan's warpath was the only exception. There was nothing left but large black cavities. The battle had taken its toll. El let go of them. Ishine looked like he was moments away from going mad. In the distance, rather than reasoning with Ichigo, Nell directly opened a Garganta beneath him and sent him back forcibly. Held in Nell's arms was Silent, who Ishine could clearly see for the first time. The man became both floored and desperate. If not for the fact that his hind was being pressed down onto the ground by Yamamoto's orders, then the man would have had attacked by now. Everyone soon left. Shiro stood alone across from the Shinigami in silence. However, the Shinigami were looking at him oddly. Even if you were a hero once, you're just a hollow now, a Shinigami spoke coldly while holding onto the body of a deceased comrade. Her animosity was justified, but Shiro could not understand what it was that they talking about. It didn't matter. Do you still wish to fight? He asked flatly. Tendril of lightning-like spiritual energy manifested around him before taking the form of many, many swords. The translucent gears hanging up over the horizon seemed to groan with a low hum. Do you think that you can just leave like this? Toshiro spoke up in fury. Do you think that you could stop me? He replied in kind. Moreover, I am not the one that you should be looking out for. He leveled his stare at Yamamoto, who'd been silent since the beginning. Right now, the demeanor and aura that Shiro was outputting were identical, if not greater than how he had been once before. How much of this could have had been avoided if you'd just decided to speak rather than mercilessly kill all those years ago? Shiro spoke with a weary, yet reminiscent tone while looking at all the dead. He shook his head. Don't ever appear in front of Coyote again. This time she was too concerned on my behalf, but she will try to kill you. You hurt her too much for her not to hate you. Yamamoto did not reply, his brows knitted together. Perhaps, he had actually been wrong. He still recalled the way that Coyote had tried to reason with him to let her and her family off in the past. He hadn't listened then because hollows were never to be trusted. They lost their humanity as souls after falling into evil. Yet, had that truly been the right conclusion? Yamamoto did not know. However, what he did know was that if the Vasto of White was back to his same level of power in the past, then even he stood no chance. For the safety of the Shinigami under him, he could not allow anyone to move recklessly and inadvertently set off the Vasto of White. The situation called for caution. Can the words of a hollow even be trusted? Zaraki spoke up in the silence while leering for a fight. Zaraki's words echoed much of the opinions of the gathered Shinigami. Shiro did not raise himself to the provocation. If that's how you all see it then, fine. Shiro turned around to leave through a garganta that he had created. Just know that if hollows were really the monsters that you all see them to be, then none of you would be alive right now. All at once, the four pillars supporting the dimension of the fake Karakura town shattered into pieces at the hands of four massive swords that had formed from the ether. The energy that Shiro was outputting was large enough to distort the very realm. The Shinigami tensed, but the spiritual pressure was soon reeled back like a sheathed sword. They stared at Shiro's back in silence, beads of sweat trailing down their foreheads. A monster, I am not. Shiro returned to Hueco Mundo to deal with its intruders. Once again, all the Shinigami thought back to what they had seen in a different reality. A hero of another time. An ally of justice that opposed them. Then did that mean that they were the ones that were truly evil? None wished to dwell on that topic any longer. Yamamoto simply sighed. The future was looking bleak. Check the description for the links to the author.